too much to do. Listen, don't mention the war. I mentioned it once, but I think I got away with it all right.
There was a moment in Fawlty Towers so explosive, the BBC quietly stopped showing it. Not because the show failed, not because ratings dropped, but because one scene crossed a line no one could uncross. For years, it vanished from repeat schedules. Later, streaming platforms cut it apart. And today, most people don't even realize what they're missing. So what was in that scene, and why did it make one of Britain's greatest sitcoms suddenly feel dangerous? Before Fawlty Towers became a symbol of chaos, it was just a place to sleep. In 1970, the Monty Python team arrived in the quiet seaside town of Torquay while filming Flying Circus. They booked into a small hotel called the Gleneagles. Nothing fancy, nothing unusual, at least not at first. The man running the place, Donald Sinclair, had a strange way of welcoming guests. He didn't greet them, he inspected them. He watched their movements. He treated simple questions like suspicious behavior. One night, a briefcase was left in the lobby. Instead of asking who it belonged to, Sinclair made a decision that would later sound unbelievable. He picked it up and threw it over a garden wall. He thought it was a bomb. To him, the guests weren't customers, they were threats. When someone used their cutlery incorrectly, he corrected them. When someone complained, he became colder, sharper, almost offended that they expected service at all. John Cleese didn't argue, he didn't complain, he watched. What fascinated him wasn't the rudeness, it was the confidence. The way Sinclair seemed convinced he was right, no matter how absurd his behavior became. Cleese took notes, literal notes. Years later, those moments would become Basil Fawlty's DNA, the suspicion, the rage, the belief that the world was against him. But there was one thing Cleese understood early on. A man like this doesn't think he's the villain. He thinks he's the victim. And that single misunderstanding between how someone sees themselves and how others see them would become the engine of Fawlty Towers. But that wasn't the dangerous part. The danger came later, when Basil's behavior stopped being fictional and started reflecting something far more uncomfortable. John Cleese didn't set out to offend anyone. Long before Basil Fawlty was shouting behind a reception desk, Cleese was known for something else entirely: precision. He cared about structure, timing, control. Every joke had to land exactly where it was meant to. At Cambridge, with the Footlights Comedy Club, Cleese learned that laughter wasn't accidental, it was engineered. A pause here, a word choice there. Comedy, when done properly, could expose people without them realizing it. That idea followed him into Monty Python. Python wasn't polite, it didn't explain itself, it challenged authority by making it look ridiculous. Generals, politicians, experts, anyone who took themselves too seriously was fair game. But Fawlty Towers was different. Instead of attacking systems, it focused on one man, one small hotel, one fragile ego trying to appear important. Basil wasn't powerful, he wasn't clever, he was desperate. That's what made him funny. Cleese understood something dangerous about comedy. If you make the wrong person the hero, the joke collapses. So Basil was never meant to win. His insults always came back to hurt him. His arrogance always exploded in his face. At least that was the plan. When the first series aired in 1975, critics didn't know what to do with it. Some called it messy, others called it exhausting, but audiences stayed. They recognized the tension. They saw people they'd met before, bosses, neighbors, themselves. Then came the second series. The pressure was higher, expectations were sharper, and somewhere in that process, Cleese and Connie Booth wrote a scene that pushed Basil past incompetence and into history. At the time, it felt like just another escalation. No one realized it would become the moment people stopped laughing for the same reasons. The episode was called The Germans. On paper, it didn't sound dangerous. A group of German guests arrive at the hotel.
Basil, already fragile on a good day, is recovering from a blow to the head. He's confused, unfiltered, desperate to appear polite. Before greeting them, he gives his staff one clear instruction.
Can't! I've got too much to do. Listen, don't mention the war. I mentioned it once, but I think I got away with it all right.
Don't mention the war. Of course, that's exactly what happens. What follows isn't a single joke, but a collapse. Basil spirals into a fast-talking rant filled with Second World War references. He can't stop himself. Each attempt to recover only makes things worse. Then, in a moment that would echo for decades, he marches across the hotel lobby, stiff-armed, shouting nonsense in a mock imitation of Adolf Hitler. At the time, studio laughter filled the room. But outside the studio, the reaction split. Some viewers saw the joke clearly. Basil wasn't mocking Germans. He was exposing himself, his ignorance, his obsession, his inability to let go of the past. The target was British awkwardness, the way the war still hovered in conversations that had no reason to include it. Others saw something else entirely. They saw history turned into slapstick, pain treated lightly, a line crossed, even if the intention was satire. The BBC noticed immediately. Complaints arrived within days, not about violence, not about language, about taste, about embarrassment, about whether some jokes should ever be repeated. The episode wasn't banned, but it was no longer safe. And once something stops being safe, the rules quietly change. Officially, nothing happened. No press release, no apology, no announcement that anything was wrong. But inside the BBC, the tone changed. When repeat schedules were discussed, the Germans became complicated. Other episodes rotated freely. This one raised questions. Was it still appropriate? Would it land the same way? What would international audiences think? For a public broadcaster, perception mattered. Britain was still shaping its post-war image. The BBC wasn't just airing comedy, it was exporting culture. And suddenly, one scene felt like a risk they couldn't fully control. So the episode appeared less often. Sometimes it was skipped entirely. Sometimes it returned with quiet edits. Viewers noticed gaps in reruns, but no explanation followed. The silence made the episode feel larger than it was. Strangely, the backlash wasn't universal. In Germany, reactions were mixed, but not explosive. Some viewers understood the joke immediately. They didn't see themselves being mocked. They saw a British man embarrassing himself. To them, Basil wasn't offensive. He was outdated. That irony didn't make things easier, because now the discomfort wasn't about who was hurt, it was about who felt exposed. The episode had turned into a mirror, and not everyone liked what it reflected. Years passed. Fawlty Towers grew in status. Quotes became legend. Basil became iconic. But the episode never fully escaped its shadow. It waited. And decades later, when television moved from broadcast schedules to streaming platforms, that unresolved tension came back, louder than ever. For a long time, the episode simply existed in limbo. It wasn't gone, it wasn't fully embraced, it lingered. Then television changed. When streaming platforms began digitizing old shows, Fawlty Towers entered a new world, one without context, without era, without explanation. Episodes that once aired years apart now played back to back. Jokes written for a 1970s audience landed on screens shaped by modern expectations. And suddenly, the Germans wasn't just controversial, it was a problem.
Some platforms removed the episode entirely. Others edited out moments they feared would offend. Scenes disappeared without warning. Viewers clicked play and found something missing, even if they couldn't quite explain what. The decision reignited an argument no one had settled decades earlier. Was this responsible curation or quiet censorship? Fans were furious. They argued the edits destroyed the point of the joke. Basil wasn't the hero, he was the embarrassment. By removing the scene, platforms weren't protecting viewers, they were misunderstanding satire. John Cleese didn't stay quiet. He pushed back publicly, saying the joke was never aimed at Germans, but at British obsession with the war. To him, removing the episode didn't make comedy safer, it made it dumber. But the platforms didn't back down, because now the pressure wasn't coming from letters or broadcasters. It was coming from algorithms, headlines, and global audiences who didn't share the same cultural memory. And that raised a new question, more dangerous than the original one. If a joke needs its time period to survive, should it survive at all? Here's the part most people misunderstand. Fawlty Towers was never canceled. No executive shut it down, no network pulled the plug, no scandal ended it overnight. John Cleese walked away. After just 12 episodes, he decided to stop, not because the show failed, but because it succeeded too well. Expectations grew, scrutiny followed, every line was examined, every joke carried weight, and after the Germans, that pressure changed shape. Cleese later explained that writing the show had become exhausting. Each episode took months. Every farce had to be perfect. One weak moment, he feared, would damage the legacy forever. But there was something else. The reaction to the Germans proved that Fawlty Towers was no longer just a sitcom. It was a cultural object, a symbol, something people argued over. That made future episodes riskier, not funnier. Stopping early preserved the magic, yet the myth grew anyway. Over time, the story shifted. The controversial scene became a convenient explanation, a neat ending to a messy truth. It felt right to believe one joke ended everything. That belief gave the episode power. It transformed a single scene into a legend, a warning, a line in the sand about comedy, history, and taste. And that legend only grew stronger as new generations discovered the show without the context, without the era, without the rules it was written under. Which leads to one final question. If a comedy can survive for decades, but one scene still makes people uncomfortable, what does that say about the joke? And what does it say about us? Today, Fawlty Towers is called a classic. It's ranked among the greatest sitcoms ever made, quoted endlessly, studied, celebrated. Its chaos feels timeless. Its characters feel immortal. And yet one scene still makes people hesitate before pressing play. That's the paradox. Out of 12 episodes, it wasn't the shouting, the insults, or the cruelty that caused trouble. It was a joke about memory, about obsession, about a country that couldn't stop tripping over its own past. Don't mention the war became shorthand for social failure, for saying the wrong thing at the worst possible moment. The line survived because it was true, not about Germans, but about discomfort. The episode didn't take Fawlty Towers off the air. It did something stranger. It exposed how comedy changes once it leaves its time, how jokes harden, how intention fades, how audiences shift. What once felt sharp begins to feel dangerous, not because it attacks, but because it reveals. Basil Fawlty was never meant to be admired. He was meant to be endured, laughed at, recognized. And maybe that's why the scene still unsettles people. Because the joke only works if you realize you're not supposed to agree with him. And when that realization disappears, so does the safety net. So the scene remains, cut, edited, debated, quoted, defended, removed, reintroduced. Not because it ended a show, but because it keeps asking a question no era answers the same way twice. And the uncomfortable part is this. The joke hasn't changed. Only the audience has.